Good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Courier. I am here from the Sundance Film Festival, where I am a senior programmer. Welcome to this Masterclass with Joe Berlinger. The reason I am here is because we pretty much consider Joe Berlinger family at Sundance. He has had 6 films that have premiered in our festival, and I want to make sure I get them right in their order. His first film that was at Sundance was called Brother's Keeper, which premiered in 1992, I mean. The second was Paradise Lost, The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills, which became the first of a trilogy. The third film, Metallica, Some Kind of Monster, premiered in 2004. The fourth film, Crude, premiered in 2009. The fifth, Under African Skies, in 2012. And his most recent film, Whitey, United States of America versus James J. Bulger, premiered this past year at Sundance and is here at Sheffield. He's an Academy Award nominee, a Peabody winner, a 6-time Emmy nominee, and he's been in this business for decades, and he is indeed a master. Please join me in welcoming Joe Berlinger.
The man behind the curtain.
Here you go. Hey, thank you.
All right, what an intro.
We created a new section of our festival at Sundance a few years ago called the premiere section, specifically for basically the masters of documentary. And so Joe is one. And I guess the first thing I would like to start off is, we've talked a little bit about what we're going to talk about, and Joe, in his humble way, doesn't want to just talk about his work one after another, but we are going to do some of that. But we're going to talk about the documentary life, but it always starts with your life. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background first?
First of all, thank you. David's been a great friend and a supporter of my work, and the Sundance Film Festival really, I think I attribute much of my success to Sundance kind of giving my films the thumbs up, so it's much appreciated. I've had a very strange and circuitous route to filmmaking, and I think my biggest achievement is that I've just been able to make a living at it for 25 years. So that's extraordinary in this business, because it's not the easiest thing in the world being a documentary filmmaker, as many of you know, because I assume, actually, how many filmmakers are out there, just so I know? Yeah, so it's not an easy business. So the fact that I've gotten a paycheck for 2.5 decades is the hell with the films, no, I'm just kidding. Survival is key, and I've seen lots of changes, and that's kind of, as we talked about, that's kind of what I'd love to talk about, how the business has changed and all that kind of thing, because I think that's more interesting. And the funny thing about being considered a master and having survived this long is that I never intended to actually, be a filmmaker, so that's kind of funny to me. I was a language major in college, and was, one of the languages that I spoke quite well was German, and my German degree got me a job at Ogilvy and Mather, which is one of the big ad agencies, in their Frankfurt office. They were looking for some young American who spoke some languages for a particular project, and I just kind of stumbled my way into the advertising world. And it wasn't until that I was in Germany on a TV commercial set for the first time where I looked around and I saw the lights and cameras and said, oh, I want to be a filmmaker. Originally I went to college speaking languages, just wanting to live in Europe and speak languages and figure out how to make a living doing that. But when I actually achieved that and saw filmmaking, that's when I decided I wanted to be a filmmaker. And I ended up getting myself back to New York with Ogilvy and Mather as a producer on television commercials. And by coincidence, one day we hired the Maisel brothers, the famous documentarians who did Gimme Shelter and Grey Gardens, and are, amongst the forefathers of cinema verite documentary making, and I hit it off with David Maisels at lunch one day, and I said, hey, I want to get in the film business, and he said, hey, we'd like to do more advertising work, so can you help sell us to advertising agencies? So I joined the Maisel brothers at their documentary company at the age of 25, basically to sell them for commercials to ad agencies. And the irony to me about all that is I wasn't looking to get into documentary per se. I was looking to just get into filmmaking, and I've always kind of joked that had I hit it off with Ridley Scott and had hired him to do a commercial, you know, maybe I would have had a very different path. And so that's always been that chance encounter with documentary, which has now become my life, is kind of has actually been like a principle for me about being open to the story and being open to wherever things take you. And that's, I think, the great joy of documentary making, is following a story that's unfolding. I mean, there's all kinds of documentaries, historical documentaries, you know, biographical. I mean, the thing I like to do is that cinema verite film where you're following a story as it's unfolding and you don't know where it goes. And I think that in my coincidental entree into documentaries really informed my filmmaking philosophy, which is, I mean, and this is not some big brilliant revelation, I'm not the only person to say this, but you know, if you have to remain open to the situation that you're filming, otherwise you might miss the story. Because, for example, I think the films that I'm best known for are films I made with a filmmaking partner named Bruce Sinofsky, with the Paradise Lost series about the West Memphis Three, in which 3 kids were wrongfully convicted of this triple homicide of 3 8-year-olds. 3 8-year-olds were found in the woods, allegedly sacrificed to the devil in a blood ritual, a satanic devil-worshipping ritual in the backwoods of Arkansas. And we read about the arrests, you know, of these kids. The trial was going to take place, you know, 9 months later. And we thought we were going down to make a film about guilty teenagers, because that's what the press was saying. The police were saying it's an open and shut case. And so we went down at HBO's request with the mission of telling a film about bad kids who became devil-worshipping killers. And had we locked into that, you know, and not been open to what the story really was, we would have missed the real story, which was, you know, everyone else was telling the story of bloodthirsty killers. And, you know, we realized a couple of months into the process that we felt these kids were innocent, and we ended up telling the story of these kids being wrongfully arrested and then wrongfully convicted at trial. And so that's my little anecdote about, you know, just being open to where the story takes you. Did I answer your question?
You did.
All right,
and
good.
I want to take you back a little, though, before that, to Brothers Keeper, your first film, which won the Audience Award at Sundance. So sort of people stood up and took notice of Joe Berlinger. And there's an interesting similarity between that film and the Paradise Lost films, partly about the communities that they depict,
right,
besides just the subjects of the film. And so we have 3 clips today, and I think this would be a good time to watch the first one, which entails, we'll see a bit more of the Paradise Lost films in a second clip, I think, but in this first film, this first clip, hey Dave, if Joe and I stay on stage, are we going to see the stuff from there? Okay, so we'll just sit here and watch it, and this one's about 8 or so minutes long, so, you know, dig yourselves in and enjoy.
Spelling Gray, take 1.
Okay, so we got legal cases, music, and it's curious to me that in all your films, one of the things that I love about Joe's work the most is each one of those things is never just what it is. They're always a springboard to talk about something else. But I want to begin with Brothers Keeper and that clip of Spalding Gray, and because it's a good story of how that became your trailer. So why don't you talk about that first?
And for people who don't know who Spalding Gray is, it's probably less impactful, but Spalding Gray, unfortunately, who committed suicide about 8 years ago. But he was a big New York monologuist and was very popular in New York and LA. And he actually had given us the audience award. He was the presenter at Sundance.
Where he apparently saw no other good movies.
You know, Brothers Keeper was made in a time when, you know, we shot on 16 millimeter and pre-digital era on every level. And even though the film won a big prize at Sundance and got great reviews, the film also came at a time before this big golden age of the popularity of documentaries being released theatrically. So it was still very unusual for a documentary to be released theatrically. And we went to Sundance, you know, expecting to get a deal, and everyone loved the film, but nobody wanted to release it. So we, because of my advertising and marketing background, I said, the hell with it, we're going to release it ourselves. And we ended up, it was kind of a last minute decision and trying to book theaters, and we ultimately decided to release the film. And so the summer before the first bookings were made, we had booked it in a bunch of theaters. We said, oh my God, we need a trailer. But the movie was at the lab, and in those days to either 16 millimeter and only a handful of places would play it, or blow it up to 35 millimeter for a real theatrical release. And we had decided to spend the money to blow the film up from 16 to 35. And that was a very time-consuming process back then. This is summer of '92. And the lab had the film all summer, blowing it up. You know, it's a very, you know, frame by frame, time-consuming process. When we realized we needed a trailer, and all of a sudden we said, "Oh my God, we don't have our footage, we don't have our film. The negative is with the lab." And so, just very spontaneously, I had remembered Spalding actually gave that very same speech when he was presenting us with the award. He said, you know, I really like this film, but I had to pee and I couldn't tear myself away to pee. And so I called Spalding up and I said, hey Spalding, would you tell that story for a movie trailer for us, because we don't have any footage available. You know, which is kind of crazy to make a trailer for your movie without any footage being available. And so we made that trailer, and actually it ended up being kind of like its own little cult hit, because in New York and LA, Spalding was hugely popular, and there's this quietness to this trailer that when it's cut in between all the, you know, loud Hollywood trailers, just, you know, you'd walk into a theater and when that trailer came on, people, the popcorn munching would stop, and you could like hear a pin drop, like people like all of a sudden started paying attention to it, and, you know, enjoying it and laughing. And the trailer itself, you know, that summer actually had developed this, oh, you got to go see that trailer for Brothers Keeper, which was quite, you know, not the intention, but it ended up being, I think that trailer, as much as anything, caused this film to be very, I mean, we were early self-distributors. I like to think that Brothers Keeper, even though it's sometimes not credited as much as I would like it to, I think Brothers Keeper, because it was released via self-distribution in '92, was one of the early films that really helped push, you know, that mid-'90s wave of really successful theatrical releases of documentaries, because we came in there and not a distributor in the business wanted to take the film. You know, Michael Moore had just had his success with Roger and Me, of course, but there was very little late 80s, early 90s theatrical activity for documentaries, which seems unbelievable when you think about what happened in the mid-'90s. But Brothers Keeper, through self-distribution, ended up grossing about $2 million, which was, you know, a big sum considering tickets back then were $5 a pop, and it was just two guys schlepping a couple of film prints around the country. So it allowed us to have a financial base to start a company, and I do think its success, helped. We weren't the only one, but I think we helped auger in that mid-90s hoop dreams and capturing the Friedmans, and because audiences started accepting, and then distributors started going after documentaries at the box office. I've now lived through several waves, and unfortunately, I think the pendulum has swung away, which is another topic we can discuss. I think the pendulum has swung away from documentaries being sought after by distributors and audiences wanting them at the box office. Of course, there's always exceptions, and there'll always be a couple that break on through, but I think we're in a new era that is a little troubling that we can talk about, but that's the Spalding Gray story.
All right. So I mentioned that there's a connection in my mind between Brothers Keeper and the Paradise Lost films, in that they both not only there are legal cases that are the springboard for a greater story, which is part of the springboard thing I was talking about, and but both of them depict communities. One, we'll talk about the differences.
Well, in many ways, has anyone seen Brothers Keeper? Do you know the film? Not that many. Yeah, I mean, Brothers Keeper is a really amazing story of these three old dairy farming brothers who lived like people might have lived 200 years ago. They shared a shack, heated with a wood-burning stove, and just lived a very bare bones existence. It was a little more than that too. I mean, these were four brothers that all shared the same bed together. One of them was accused of killing the other in the police at first said it was a mercy killing, and then they said it was a sex gone bad killing. I mean, these are guys in their late 50s, early 60s. Even though this little rural farming community in upstate New York, even though they had previously treated these guys like, the smelly old coots on the hill that you should stay away from and tell your children to not go wandering off over there, even though the community felt that way, which was only a town of about 500 people, during most of the Ward brothers' lives, when they heard that Delbert, one of the brothers with a long, scraggly beard, was accused of murdering his bedmate brother Bill, they said, wait a second, that's not right. Delbert wouldn't hurt a flea. This is obviously the police taking advantage of a semi-literate, somewhat slow, because he had a very low IQ person. And in this amazing show of community support, they held fundraisers and embraced the brothers in a way that they've never been embraced before, because they were treated like the village idiots that you stay away from previously. And so the town just believed fundamentally in their innocence, that the state police had coerced a confession from a not so bright guy. They held potluck dinners and all sorts of fundraisers, and we covered the whole process. And interestingly, as the town started paying attention to these guys, they kind of came out of their shell, they became socialized, and they started enjoying the attention because they never had this attention before. Ultimately, the guy is acquitted at trial, and it's just this the tagline for the movie was a heartwarming tale of murder, because it was just it was a feel-good movie on a certain level, even though it dealt with a murder case. And I think it showed the best of American values, of small-town America. That is juxtaposed with the Paradise Lost series, and actually that trailer for some reason was for Paradise Lost 2 as opposed to the original Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost 1, the original, was, we had read about, as I was saying before, we read about these arrests of these three teenagers in 1993. They had been accused of these horrific child slayings. 3 8-year-old boys were found in the woods, just, brutally slaughtered by a ditch bank. Their bodies were naked and bound like hogtied together. And you know, and the town thought these three kids did it in part because, you know, they were the local weirdos. The alleged ringleader, a guy named Damien Eccles, wore a long black coat in the summer and was into Wicca, you know, or white witchcraft, and so, you know, we went down thinking we were making a film about guilty teenagers. In fact, I had tried to make a film a few years before about the Jamie Bolger case here, you know, where the young kid was killed on the railroad tracks, but couldn't get access to that case, but fascinated by the idea of kids killing kids. And so we went down with that mission to tell that story, convinced that we were making a film about bad guys because everyone else was. And we realized these kids were not guilty. Thought for sure it would come out at trial that they weren't guilty because we were finding all sorts of things that just didn't make sense. But the trial was literally, you know, just a witch hunt where musical tastes, you know, because they listened to heavy metal music, the lyrics were introduced into trial because he read, you know, Damien read Stephen King, passages from Stephen King novels were introduced into trial as evidence that he's, you know, this crazy stuff. And that film, I think, is in many ways the mirror image, you know, of Brothers Keeper, because I think the town, you know, just got wrapped up in satanic hysteria. They were all out for blood. You know, on a certain level, understandably, you know, it was a horrible crime. Everyone wanted it solved. The police were telling them it was an open and shut case, so people were believing the authorities. But it's in many ways the mirror image of Brothers Keeper, because I think the town showed the worst of American values of just, you know, wanting revenge and retribution and putting reason aside and just trying to wrap a case up because they picked out the three local weirdos. So the two films are, I think, nice companion pieces. And they also, you know, they both use trials, you know, just from a filmmaking aesthetic standpoint, they both use trials as a device. And with Brothers Keeper, again, when I say things about my films, I'm not acting like we're the only ones to have done this, you know, so take all of this with a grain of salt. But I think with Brothers Keeper, what we were attempting to do is to, and I think, and again, there are many exceptions to the rule, so I'm sure you can throw me a lot of examples, but in general, I think the 80s was a very fallow period in documentary. You know, it's what we now know and what has become so popular and what became really popular in the 90s, what, you know, these great ambiguous character portraits and documentaries that have real narrative, dramatic structure wasn't happening. I mean, it happened, you know, in the 60s. I think the great technological revolution of portable sync sound that Maisels, Pennebaker, Wiseman, all those guys were part of, and then they totally changed the game in how we think about documentary, that it's not just reportage, and it's not, you know, going out into the real world and being able to get sync sound opened up this world of documentary for artistic purposes, cinematic purposes, you know, not trying to be just reporting, but you could also create these ambiguous human character portraits. You could have narrative structure, things like that. But I think that kind of was dying, and again, there's many examples that you could say, well, that's not quite true, but generally speaking, it was kind of falling out of favor, I think, in the 80s. And so what we were trying to do with Brothers Keeper, and why I was particularly attracted to the trial structure, is to even push what was happening in the 60s even further, to imbue a documentary with narrative structure. Again, we take it for granted today, but I think, you know, Brothers Keeper is an early example of what many filmmakers were trying to do in the early 90s, and that is to, you know, revitalize the documentary out of just advocacy or reporting, but just to make this beautiful cinematic experience out of nonfiction. And so we did things which at the time were highly criticized by some of the more traditional documentarians. You know, we had this incredible music score for the film, and people said, no, you can't put a music score to a documentary because that enhances the mood and it's manipulative, and you're telling people what to look and feel. It was shot very cinematically. And most importantly, by following a trial, you know, it takes all the qualities of, you know, fiction, not the part that is untrue, but just the dramatic quality. You know, a trial is an opportunity to have these great narrative structure, you know, rising and, you know, classic definition of drama, you know, Aristotelian definition of drama, rising and falling action, a clear beginning, middle, and end. You know, the very definition of drama is conflict, and so you have two opposing sides, each vying for the truth in a trial. And so, for me, originally, you know, advocacy had nothing to do with anything. That's not why I became a filmmaker with Brothers Keeper. So I was attracted to the trial form for aesthetic reasons, because it just gives this perfect dramatic structure. And it worked. You know, the film was, you know, well received, and it feels very cinematic. And we went into Paradise Lost with the same kind of vibe, you know, purely a cinematic experience. The irony of Paradise Lost is by the end of it, I was convinced that the three wrong guys were in prison, and that's what awakened in me the advocacy part of my filmmaking, which has been a very strong, you know, part of who I am as a filmmaker since Paradise Lost. And, you know, everyone makes documentaries for different reasons: reporting, advocacy, storytelling. And in my early years, I used to think that, you know, the tension, you know, that advocacy and good storytelling and narrative structure were at odds with each other, because to be a good advocate, you know, you don't want to tell some of the things that might make you think negatively about your subject. And so that's bad reporting. You know, so advocacy and reporting and good storytelling, you know, and as a storyteller, you want to withhold certain information till the right dramatic moment, but that's in conflict with, you know, being a good reporter. But eventually, you know, I think I've come to the conclusion you can be a good advocate, but, you know, it's important to tell. You know, I think some advocacy films that shy away from showing both sides are actually not as good an advocacy film as they think they are, because you don't want people to feel like they're being lectured to very passively. You want the audience to be engaged and to treat them, you know, like a jury, and to let them weigh the pros and cons and come to the conclusion themselves, instead of you kind of banging a singular message over their heads. I don't know why I'm getting off on this tangent, but Paradise Lost, when I realized that, you know, these guys were in prison for a crime they didn't commit, it kind of awakened in me you know, the advocacy part of filmmaking. But trials I've always been attracted to that structure, because it's a great way to have a dramatic through line.
What's it like when you set out to make one film, and then you discover what you have is not the film you set out to make? And did you have to rally and change what you set out to do? And does it kind of like piss you off? Because you know, you got this plan, and then you...
No, I mean, every film is this great, as filmmakers know. Every film is, you know, a great journey. And the whole act of discovery and what you're doing, to me, is part of the process. So I never mind. I think every film turns out to be different than I expected it to be, you know. So I like that part of things. You know, the Metallica movie never was intending to be this big, grand, epic story of this band disintegrating. I mean, it started out as Lars, the drummer, and I were very friendly because they gave us music to the original Paradise Lost film, because Metallica lyrics had been introduced into the trial as evidence that Damien was a killer. So naturally, I wanted Metallica music in that film, you know, and that started a friendship. And when Metallica was going into the studio for the first time in 5 years, Lars said, "Hey, we're going into the studio. Why don't you follow us around, and we'll do a little filming." And really, this was like right after Napster, but before iTunes and before the whole digital revolution in music, when record companies were still selling physical CDs, and all that film intended to be at the beginning was they wanted 20 minutes, the record label wanted 20, 25 minutes of behind the scenes in the studio slapped onto a CD so that they could physically sell CDs. And when I arrived to start making that film, the bass player, Jason Newsted, had quit the band, and Laura said, oh, you know, I don't think we're going to do this. I don't think we're making a record. The band is falling apart. And I said, okay, let me stick around and let's see where we can take this thing. And, you know, it turned out to be this, spending
Let's get you all in a room and have some therapy here with Metallica.
That turned out to be this amazing 3-year journey. So I love when things don't turn out to be what they're supposed to, because that's life, you know?
Yeah. Made me think I'm going to jump forward a bit to the Under African Skies, another film with, you know, music film that you made, which I think of as another film where on paper it's Paul Simon going to South Africa to do a concert, but the film is about so much more than that. So that's what I mean. I'm talking about the springboard thing. So why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Well, Sony came to me and said, you know, it's the 25th anniversary of the Graceland record. You remember the Graceland record, you know, this fusion of African sounds, and said, you know, we were thinking about doing something. I said, well, are you thinking about the apartheid story as well? Because the record was accused of, you know, Paul Simon was accused of having broken the cultural boycott that was in place to bring down the apartheid regime of South Africa, and they were like, oh, no, we can't go there. And I said, well, I don't want to make the film unless we can go there. So I met with Paul and convinced Paul that we should tell that story because it touches it's a wound for him, because the album came out and was highly praised musically, but also criticized that he did something terrible, you know, that he broke the boycott, which I always thought was a strange argument, because the boycott, if people remember, was about white audiences in South Africa. It was about, you know, musicians going to South Africa and playing for white segregated audiences where black people were not welcome. What Paul was doing was recording with black South Africans and exporting that culture around the world, and I thought that was a good thing. And yet he was highly criticized for it. Musicians today still criticize Paul for it. And so really, to me, the film was about exploring that controversy, and also, though, exploring it with Paul by taking this journey, and because to him, it's even at the age of 72 with all this tremendous success, it's still kind of an open wound for him. So, you know, that film became interesting for me once we were able to push it in that direction.
And
which we don't have a clip of, I understand.
We do not.
Right, we don't have a clip.
Yeah, sorry. It's really good.
If
you haven't seen it, I highly recommend that you see it. But I had to bring it up because I love that movie, and I'm trying to, you know, talk about your work, but talk about the work also. And you mentioned that it's like, you know, you've managed to make a living as a filmmaker for decades now, and specifically as a documentary filmmaker, that's not easy.
Yeah.
So maybe you want to talk a little bit about like what you got to do to keep.
Yeah, I mean, I think you got to work really hard as one thing, and then the other thing is, I mean, for me, everyone has to find the formula. You know, like Doug Block, who I just ran into. You know, he does, you know, wedding videos, you know, like very high-end wedding videos. For me, my thing has been advertising, and that was the advantage of me starting off in you know, advertising at the beginning of my career. I've always had that as part of my kind of portfolio of activities, as I do television commercials and web content and that type of thing, which I highly recommend. It's also a very competitive world. So, and I guess the lesson is that it's hard. I think it's hard to just make a good living as a documentary maker doing only documentaries, because even with the relative success that I have had, I don't think without advertising I could have, you know, supported myself as well as I would have liked to. So you just have to, you have to figure something out. For me, again, it's been every year I do 2 or 3 or 4 TV commercial projects, and that keeps it going for me, But it's too bad. It's such a, it's like, why are we so underpaid in this field? Why is that?
I wish I knew, Joe.
Why is that? Why are we so underpaid in this field? It's terrible. Anyway, commercials have been good for me.
Good
for me.
You're paid in different ways.
Actually, that is true. That is true. Actually, I would not be doing commercial. It's the films that inform my commercial career and give me the reputation to get that work. So it's actually.
Well, that is true too. And these films have impact.
And that's true. We shouldn't only talk about money. I'm very proud of the work that I've done. And the Paradise Lost films, 3 films over 2 decades, took a long time, but got 3 people out of prison who were wrongfully convicted. So,
in fact, that is a good segue to our next clip, because I think we have a little bit of. Let's go with the next clip, Dave, and we'll see
what it is.
We'll see what it is. But I know there's some one of the Paradise Lost films in there too. I think the last one. Okay, so not all documentary filmmakers have their own television series.
Well, that just happened. That's taken 20 years, so 22 years.
So that last clip is from a brand new series that Joe has on Al Jazeera America called The System. And it happened, I imagine, because of how you have dealt with legal cases in so many of your films. And talk a little bit about what that series is doing about that.
Yeah, I mean, Al Jazeera came to me. Al Jazeera just introduced itself in America. They bought Current TV, which used to be Al Gore's network. And, they wanted me to do some kind of legal series, which was right up my alley. And actually, they're the ones who suggested, I've never put myself on camera before because I'm not that kind of a filmmaker. I have a face made for radio, as they say. So, but so they wanted me to be the on-camera guy, so that was a little weird and unusual for me, and frankly made me nervous. Beyond the normal reasons one gets nervous about being on camera, but also because I didn't want it to get in the way of the process. Because when you're dealing with wrongful conviction cases and prosecutors, sometimes you're like breaking doors down, you're trying to get access to things, and having another camera on you just adds to the stuff of production. So it was a little concern of mine. But we did 8 shows, and I am the host. But I didn't want to do like wraparounds or stand-ups. The idea is, anything I do for the show where I'm on camera, I'm in the field in the process of doing stuff. Because originally they wanted me to just be kind of like a stand-up-y hosty thing, which I said, that's not who I am. But it worked out actually really well. The series is in the middle of airing. It's gotten great press and good ratings, and it looks like they're picking it up for a 2nd season, so that's good. I have my own TV show on Al Jazeera. That's cool.
That's good.
Yeah, so that's that.
Well, this is a good segue to our final clip, because we want to get to some questions from all of you, but our final clip is from Whitey, the United States versus James J. Bulger, which is playing here at Sheffield. I encourage you to see it. Has it played yet at all yet?
No, tomorrow.
Okay, so yeah, you've got opportunities.
The European premiere is tomorrow.
The European premiere is tomorrow. Excellent. I love this film. This is an example of why Al Jazeera would hire Joe Berlinger to do a series on legal cases.
Oh, you just say that as the programmer for Sundance, who programmed this movie.
Well,
no, I'm just kidding.
Yes, but I wouldn't have programmed it if I didn't feel that way. So let's run this clip and give these folks a tease of what they can see here at Sheffield. Talk a little bit about it. I know you don't want to spoil the movie for people who may see it. So, but talk about if you want to some of why I think of this film as such a layered film.
Yeah. And it's a little tough because I think non-American audiences have no idea who Whitey Bulger is. American audiences know that Bulger is one of our most famous criminals because he was on top of the conventional story is he was on top of the Boston underworld for decades, enabled by the FBI because the FBI made him into a confidential informant because the FBI wanted to take down the Italian mafia, and so they allowed the Irish gangsters in Boston to run amok. A story that we don't know enough about, and even if that were true, it's outrageous because when you're an informant for the FBI, you're supposed to keep your nose clean, and yet the FBI not only allowed these guys to do all sorts of criminal activity, they allowed the people to be killed and sometimes aided and abetted by the FBI. My film kind of challenges that conventional wisdom even further because there's a lot of evidence to show that he might not have been an informant at all, that's just a cover story for even deeper corruption of Bulger paying people off for information, the FBI looking the other way for far worse reasons than trying to bring down the Italian mafia, basically a lot of corruption, and that it wasn't just in Boston that this was happening, and a lot of people have died as a result. And the government should not be in the business of deciding who should live and who should die, which is essentially what they were doing in picking, okay, we're going to go after those mobsters, but we're going to let these guys, run amok. So even if the conventional story is true, there are many unanswered questions, but my film puts forward the idea with a lot of, solid questions that need to be answered, that it could actually even be worse than the conventional story.
Okay, so I think this, perfect timing for you guys. I think we have some mics in the audience, people around. So if anyone has any questions for Joe, we're going to start with that lady way in the back there. So I think this gentleman can bring you a mic and we'll give it a go.
Hi, Joe.
Hey.
Yeah, I saw Brothers Keeper when it came out, and it was one of the first feature docs I ever saw, so thank you for that.
Oh, cool.
I just wanted to, I thought you had quite an interesting couple of years there with Paradise Lost, with the kids getting out, and then with Crude. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Crude, because it's a bit of a quagmire there, and I'm just interested to hear sort of your take on everything that's happened. So I don't think you mentioned in the session.
That's true. We didn't talk about Crude.
I know. I love that you asked that question because that was one of my things I meant to talk about. So let's go.
Yeah. Well, Crude. I don't know if people have seen the film, but Crude is about Texaco's alleged pollution in the Amazon and a lawsuit by the indigenous rainforest dwellers of the Ecuadorian Amazon who were in this 17-year epic battle to hold Chevron accountable for Texaco's activities, because in 2001, Texaco and Chevron merged, so it became, in the theory of the case, Chevron's responsibility. And so I made a film about the case, very objective film. It shows both sides. Chevron certainly has legal arguments to say it's not responsible. I think my film was about a much greater moral issue than who should win the legal case. My film was very much about what we're doing to our environment, what oil production in the third world does. Even if it's legally sanctioned, it just is devastating for the local inhabitants. We see that everywhere in the world, that where there's oil production, Nigeria, elsewhere. And so, the film, I think, had an impact. I think Chevron was extremely quiet during the film's release because it does show both sides. But a new aggressive legal approach with a new firm, they decided to subpoena my footage in 2010. I wish they had done it in 2009 when the film was in theatrical release. I wish they had subpoenaed my footage. It would have been good for the film, but they waited until the film was out of release and then they subpoenaed my footage. And I felt I had an obligation both to my subjects and to my profession to fight that subpoena. You know, Chevron is the second largest oil company in the world, third largest corporation in America. I mean, deep pockets. And so it was a very ugly battle that, you know, I underestimated the viciousness of that battle. It was morally, financially, psychologically draining. You know, protections for journalists in the United States have gotten weaker and weaker, particularly at the federal level. You know, I went to court saying my footage is like any reporter's notes and should be protected, but I lost at the federal district level, appealed and lost, then had a second round about my emails, lost, appealed, lost. So literally I had to turn over all of my footage and my computer to Chevron. You know, these goons from Virginia that was like out of Men in Black, these guys with little ties came into my office with these machines and literally sucked the contents of my hard drive and all the people who worked for me. And it was just devastating, financially devastating as well. You know, Crude, the movie cost $1.2 million. Crude, the lawsuit cost, my lawsuit cost $1.3 million. And this was not me fighting a libel or defamation case or anything like that. This was a, you know, a litigant in another lawsuit. You know, Chevron was defending itself in the underlying pollution case that was the subject of my movie, saying, hey, we want your stuff, and me saying, well, you can't just get my stuff, we have to, you know, I mean, so it was you know, it was a very, and it was a bad decision for filmmakers. I mean, it set a bad precedent. Luckily, you know, the one glimmer of positivity out of it is it really kind of united the film community. Robert Redford of the Sundance Institute very vocally wrote letters and published an article in Huffington Post, and there was a, you know, not all that 1.2 million or 1.3 million came out of my pocket, thank God, because I don't have 1.3 million, but it still cost me a significant amount of money. I ended up, very strangely, I assumed my E&O insurance was going to cover this battle, and I found out a month into my lawsuit, just when the bills were starting to mount, that Chubb, my insurance carrier, said, sorry, we're not covering you for fighting a subpoena. I said, what are you talking about? This is a, I have a media policy, this is what you're supposed to be doing. And they said, no, read the fine print. You know, because I pointed to paragraph 82 that said, yes, subpoena coverage. And then they pointed me to paragraph 802 that said, you know, small print, we pay for compliance with a subpoena, not to fight a subpoena. I mean, and compliance with a subpoena is nothing. It's like the cost of a Xerox. You know?
Right.
It's the fighting of the subpoena. So I ended up learning a whole new branch of lawyering in the United States called coverage lawyers, because insurance companies routinely in all industries, insurance companies, not everyone and not in every instance, but enough that there's a whole branch of lawyers called coverage lawyers. Insurance companies routinely try to evade paying claims. And so not only am I paying big money to lawyers fighting my First Amendment battle where I thought I was covered and I wasn't, I was also now having a second lawsuit with my insurance company to pay for these claims. And it was very scary at the time. I mean, I sat at my kitchen table one summer night and said to my wife, if things don't change, if something does not change in this case, we could lose everything. So that's how scary it got. Luckily, I won my insurance battle, and you know, they didn't cover all the bills, and it still cost me money. But it was not there was a couple of months there where I thought everything was going to go. My house, everything. I mean, because they weren't kidding. You know, the other thing that Chevron was doing is they were intimating that they were going to start suing me for fraud under you know, this is me as a reporter. I have nothing to do with the underlying case, because they were postulating that there's a rarely invoked federal crime called misprision, in which you it means you observe fraud and do nothing about it. So they were saying that you, the documentary filmmaker, were observing a fraudulent case against us, Chevron, and that makes you a party to the fraud. So I was also I had to hire a white-collar criminal attorney for advice about what happens if they bring this fraud suit against me. So it was very treacherous times. Luckily, it all worked out for me personally, but it set a bad precedent for, I think, future filmmakers, unfortunately. And that is something I feel very strongly about, is that our federal laws protecting journalists have become increasingly weaker. And it's, you know, I think it gives pause to people, you know. I think, you know, I think America increasingly has become a corporatocracy where corporations are infecting every aspect of American life. And I think this is just one more example of it. But anyway.
All right, I'm gonna bring up some more treacherous times. Only because you told me you wanted to talk about this, I realized. You have had a foray into fiction filmmaking with Blair Witch 2.
Did I say I wanted to bring this up?
You said you wanted to talk about this
Right.
for some
I
reason
did?
that it's not always rosy, I guess, and also try what you might. You can't always make the film that you want to make. Are the reason when you're dealing with studios. So
Yeah. You know, I made one narrative film 14 years ago, which was the sequel to the Blair Witch Project, probably one of the most reviled films in cinema history. Certainly the most reviled sequel in cinema history. And actually, ironically, you know, and now I laugh about it. At the time, I wanted to cry. You know, I think I'm the only filmmaker in the history of cinema who we received an Emmy Award for Paradise Lost 2 in the same year that I received a Razzie Award for the worst sequel. All in the same year. So I've got my Razzie and my Emmy. You know.
and both.
Do you guys know what
sequel.
Razzie Awards are? Yeah, okay. So I got a Razzie. So
Both for
when I
sequels.
say, when I say I've gotten every award in the industry, I'm not kidding. You know, it was a horrible experience making that film. Horrible in part because, and this sounds like, you know, post-spin or whatever, but it is the truth. You know, they gave me tremendous creative freedom. I said, hey, I want to make fun of the whole idea of doing a sequel. We're going to do something very satirical. This was pre-Scream. So the idea of doing a self-referential sequel that makes fun of itself was before Scream came out. And that is the movie I shot, with very satirical performances that takes a little horrifying twist at the end. Artisan, who was the studio, I was shocked. Nobody was on the set. You know, they were. You know, I think Artisan was. This was the height of pre-internet bubble stock crash, stock mania, where Artisan was going to that. While I was shooting Blair Witch 2, they were all preparing for this massive IPO to take Artisan public on the back of the Blair Witch franchise. Again, this was months before the whole market crashed, but all the studios were just executives were at Artisan were just like figuring out how to make as much money as they could on this stock offering. So I was left alone on the set and making the film that I wanted to make, and everyone thought it was great. And I kept sending the dailies back to California, and they kept saying, "Oh, keep up the good work." And you know, literally at the 12th hour, I was sitting with the composer Carter Burwell in August, doing the score to the final movie that had been approved by everybody. And at the time, it was going to be the biggest release of a movie. It was on, just 2 months later, October, it was being released simultaneously on 3,000 screens in 6 countries, which at the time was the biggest release of a film, or so I'm told, in terms of an opening weekend. And all of a sudden, some new marketing executive was hired by Artisan and said, and they tested the film, and like for 5 people in Orange County who said, oh, we need to see more blood and this and that. And so they kind of took the film out of my hands and recut it into a traditional slasher movie when in fact my film was intended to be satirical. And so it just didn't play or cut as a, the way it was recut. Plus it was against my will and, all this stuff. So I remember sitting, it was my 39th birthday, but close enough to 40 when we all go into our funks. So it was my 39th birthday and I sat by the fax machine, still getting faxes back then. And, the publicist said, you don't want to see the reviews. And of course I am very anal and I said, yes, I do want to see the reviews. I know they're bad, but I want to see them. And so on my 30th, and the movie was released Halloween weekend, which is my birthday, it was Halloween. So I sat in front of my fax machine as one fax after another in French, German, Spanish, English, all just said that this is the biggest piece of shit that was ever made. Shame on Joe Berlinger, and, blah, blah, blah. So I went into this profound depression and thought my career was over, kind of curled up in a ball, literally and figuratively, for months. And the good news is, my wife kept coming into my home office saying, come on, snap out of it. You're Joe Berlinger, you made all these great films, snap out of it. And she said, then one day, very worried about me, she handed me Paradise Lost, the original Paradise Lost, and said, here, watch Paradise Lost and remind yourself why you're a good filmmaker, which was great advice. So I popped in Paradise Lost, and the opening title sequence is this aerial shot that you saw a bit of, which is set to the Metallica's song Sanitarium. And so I watched the opening title, and I'm like, yes, I am a good filmmaker. You're right, Lauren. Yes, yes. And so it reminded me to call. So I called. This is the point of the story. This is the good part. Is I called up Lars, who had become very good friends with me. I became good friends after, as I said, after Paradise Lost, but before the Metallica movie. So I called Lars up and I said, because he had, for years, said, well, maybe we'll do something, because I gave you the shortened version of how the Metallica film came to be a half hour ago, but really how it came to be is that, that was my first phone call after picking myself up. I called Lars, who was sympathetic, and knew that the movie did terribly. And I said, look, I got to work. I know we've talked about doing stuff. Do you got anything? Do you want me to start that film? And he said, well, we're going into the studio and the record label will probably want stuff, and why don't you, here's the guy at Elektra, call Elektra, and we'll get a little behind the scenes footage going. And so that's how the Metallica film started, and the Metallica film was the greatest time of my life for so many reasons, that it never would have happened without the utter belly flop and failure of Blair Witch 2, so I'm actually thankful that it happened. And the first, have you all seen the Metallica film? So, we're filming, therapy sessions. And so the first time I'm sitting in when I first went out there and I kind of pushed my way into the therapy session, it was just me for the first session, me alone with a camera, because we had no idea where this was going. And I remember sitting in this suite at the Ritz-Carlton in San Francisco with these icons of rock and roll bearing their souls. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't know how I got here or why I'm here or if this is going to turn into a movie, but I really need this because, look, here are these guys who are having this profound creative and existential crisis, and as was I. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't know if this is ever going to turn out to be a movie, but I really need to hear this. This is great. And in fact, one of the things we haven't talked about is for the first couple of films, including the Metallica film, I had a filmmaking partner, Bruce Sinofsky, who he and I had made many films together. But that's a rocky road and a tough thing to navigate, having a filmmaking partner, particularly when you're becoming successful together. It creates a lot of issues. And Bruce and I had broken up, and I went off as filmmaking partners, I'm happily married, don't worry. You know, Bruce and I had broken up as filmmaking partners, and he was very hurt that I had gone off to do Blair Witch 2 on my own, and the failure of Blair Witch 2, he had taken some satisfaction with. But after the first couple of therapy sessions and realizing that very much the, you know, if you know the film, the antagonism between Lars, the drummer, and James, the lead singer, is very much what was making that band crash and burn, and very much what the therapy was about, was those two guys kind of working out their relationship. And so I'm sitting here filming this alone without a crew and without my longtime partner Bruce, after having failed miserably on the worldwide stage of a very visible failure. That movie was hugely visible when it flopped. And I'm thinking to myself, you know, really, Bruce should be here, you know, and it took a lot for me to reach out, and I brought Bruce into the movie. And the behind the scenes of the making of that movie was my filmmaking partner and I, just like James and Lars, kind of working out their relationship. We worked out our relationship and kind of came to a new understanding of each other and a new appreciation. And part of that new appreciation was that we each have to, you know, we were joined at the hip, and I found that to be really uncomfortable, that I couldn't do any project without, you know, without him by my side, in the minds of other people as well. And that was kind of one of the issues that was driving my desire not to be in a partnership. But we came to a place where we both could have our own careers separately and but still do stuff together. And anyway, I don't know why I went on this tangent, but
I knew there were reasons you wanted to talk about that.
Oh yeah, right. But anyway, so yeah, so the failure of Blair Witch 2 led directly to Metallica, which was a good experience.
Anybody else out here have any questions for Joe?
So she's got the mic there.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Go ahead. We'll get you next.
I'm just wondering, what is it that draws you to an idea? Like when you cross a story or something, what is it within a particular story that makes you think, wow, that, you know, I know it's different from a film, but I'm just interested in your development process.
Yeah. And I think this is, you know, no different than I think for most filmmakers. You know, I look for individual stories, you know, where there's the seeds of drama. If you cover them, you know you're going to mark some time and something dramatic will happen, but that somehow it's a window into some larger universal theme or some stereotype to explode. I love exploding stereotypes because I find that most things are not what they appear. You know, when you hang out with heavily tattooed hard rocker Metallica dudes, you know, do you really expect them to be guys who are actually some of the most tender people you've ever met, who open up I mean, that film was incredibly brave for them to allow to be released. And so to me, the Metallica film at the end of the day is about, you know, exploding the stereotype of, you know, what these guys must be like, you know. And, you know, Brothers Keeper too, you know, if you know that movie, those three guys never change their clothes, they smell. You know, if your car broke down at the end of you know, they lived at the end of a dirt road in a rundown shack, and, you know, if your car broke down and you stumbled upon that shack, you would probably be scared to death and think, oh my God, it's Deliverance North, and run for the hills. And yet they were truly the nicest human beings and the most vulnerable, honest people I have ever met. And so I think that's, from that first experience on, I think breaking down stereotypes and showing things for how they really are, even up to Whitey. I mean, Whitey, the conventional story is that, you know, he was an FBI informant, so all this stuff all the bad things he did was okay. No, it's not okay, and B, he might not have been an informant. So anyway.
You know, I grew up in upstate New York, further upstate, but there was a woman who lived in a house, and, you know, she was considered a witch. She was the witch. This hits on two of your movies, actually.
Right.
But she was isolated. The whole community always talked about that, and she scared me. And I met her one day, and she was this sweet, sweet woman.
Yeah.
And that's what happens. Anyway, there's a gentleman here.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks, Joe. It's a pleasure to have you here. Just a question, I guess, regarding background and I guess on information about learning and researching for these particular films. You mentioned obviously beyond your own kind of, I guess, forced experience with crude and the legal side of things there. How much background, for instance, in the legal side have you had in the past, and perhaps education and learning that's been there as a support network for them unearthing the storytelling within it?
Like how much research do I do in advance, you mean?
Yeah, sorry, I just mean more so, do you have an education, I guess, specifically in legal? I mean,
Yeah.
beyond that, I suppose you learn it as you go.
Yeah, no, it's kind of learn as you go. I mean, that's the other great thing about this kind of lifestyle is you get plunged into a world and you just learn it, and then you move on to the next world, but I don't, I have no special education.
Hi, you spoke at the beginning about the changing models for filmmakers and the way that the industry has changed specifically recently with digital distribution and
Yeah.
whatnot. Obviously, things have changed so much since you started out. How has this been good for filmmakers and how has it been bad for filmmakers?
A good, complicated question that we could spend the whole session on. The digital revolution, again, you don't want to put the genie back in the bottle, but I think in some ways it's been great, and in some ways it's been terrible. When I made, I think I said this at the beginning, when I made Brothers Keeper, it was, by the time did I say this about the $400 per 10 minutes? Did I say that?
No,
Okay.
no,
All right.
you
So
haven't told that story.
when
It's great.
I started in the industry and shot Brothers Keeper, digital didn't exist, and even video was at such a clunky level. You shot documentaries on film, and so every 10 minute, by the time 16 millimeter film comes in 11-minute rolls, just for ease of saying, let's just say 10 minutes, and by the time you bought your roll of film, shot the 10 minutes, take it to the lab, develop it, then you take your 1/4 inch, because sound and picture were on separate recording devices, then you take your 1/4 inch Nagra reel and you transfer it to 16 millimeter mag stripe, and you sync that up, and by the time you're sitting at your flatbed linear editing machine, looking at your 10 minutes of dailies, you've spent $400 in 1990 dollars. So probably, 500 today or whatever. I don't know what the rate of inflation is. But, today we shoot on a card, and there's no cost for the footage. The camera, a $3,000 camera can do more, than you could ever have dreamed of 20 years ago. Nonlinear editing on your laptop is amazing. So, you don't want to go back in time, but I think the technological revolution, I think, has been fantastic for citizen journalism, which in our increasingly corporately owned world of media companies, citizen journalism is incredibly important. I think it was the seeds for the Arab Spring technology. Like, you don't want to go back in time. So all of that is good. It's lowered the cost of entry to go make a film. I think it's, much easier to make a film today than it was, but I think that's the seed of the problem. I think there are, no offense, too many filmmakers, too much competition, too many stories being told in order to make a living. It's just grown exponentially, and because of that, I think networks, which are under pressure to cut costs regardless, but particularly because there's a glut of filmmakers and ease of technology, the cost of what they'll pay has been greatly reduced. I think there's a larger problem in theatrical entertainment. It's become, because tickets are expensive and getting a babysitter, and because technology is so good at home, I think it's rare that people want to go to the cinema and spend $30 or $40 for a couple that has a child. It's when you can just watch stuff at home, and I think that's happening as well in mainstream entertainment. And so what audience tastes are now swinging to, and again, I'm speaking in broad generalities, there's always an exception to the rule, but people want to spend that kind of money for big Hollywood events. And so I think the theatrical model of documentary is challenged. It's been replaced by certain, there's a lot of great distribution platforms online, but those distribution platforms, by and large, aren't monetizing vehicles for filmmakers. And so I think we have a situation where there's a lot of filmmakers, way more than when I started, like, by 10,000% from when I started, all competing for the same reduced dollars, and I think it's a challenging environment. On the other hand, for first-time filmmakers, for people starting off in their career, it truly is easy to get into the business. It's easier to make that first film than it used to be. Certainly in American television, I can't speak for television here, the vast majority of television is nonfiction based, so there seems to be more opportunity, but I think even that is illusory because what people are after in nonfiction television, what the networks want is, Deadliest Catch, Ice Road Truckers, kind of pure, almost semi-prurient looks into people's careers and lives as opposed to thoughtful, the kind of documentaries I grew up making, Brothers Keeper, Paradise Lost, those are harder and harder to make for television. And there's, I think all of the networks actually, and if there's anyone out there, please forgive me, but I think all of the networks have become almost indistinguishable from each other. I mean, can you tell me, Deadliest Catch, Long Island Medium, Ice Road Truckers, which network they are on and why? The fact that History Channel does Ice Road Truckers, it's like, what does that mean, So it's definitely a changing landscape. I didn't mean to end on such a bummer, but, but that's the situation,
All right, so you can end on something upbeat, I guess. We'll wrap up, but if...
Let's talk about the environment then.
Oh, good.
Okay.
That's upbeat.
Yeah, I'm just kidding.
No, if there were one thing when you were a young filmmaker that you wish somebody had, who was in your place right now, had told you, what would that be?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know. Just keep doing it and don't lose faith because things, at least for me, work out. It's very competitive. You have to work really hard, but just stick to your vision and hopefully things work out. I think I've never met a filmmaker who, if in their core of their being, truly believes. The world is designed to say no. Gatekeepers are designed to say no. Most people get no said to them. And so if you just, we were told no, we don't want to distribute Brothers Keeper, and we just did it ourselves. So I think if you don't, in your gut, wake up every morning and truly believe you can do this, it's going to be harder. You have to truly believe you can do this because it's harder than ever to do anything, and you just have to believe in it. And I think it's a cliche to say, and I don't want to embarrass a room of filmmakers by saying, the most important thing about making films is you got to find regardless of the social issue you're trying to advocate for or whatever your agenda is for getting into filmmaking, to make a film, you need a good story, good characters, and you got to craft it as a good storytelling experience. And so as long as you do that, and you have whether it's about the local baker or the polar ice caps melting, whatever your story is, if it's a well-told story and you believe in your mission, in your gut, like when you wake up each morning. If you're riddled with self-doubt, it's not going to work. You got to believe in what you're doing. And I think everyone will succeed if they truly believe in what they're doing.
Awesome. Gotta work hard.
Work hard. Gotta believe.
Thank you all for coming out. Let's give it up for Joel.
All right, thanks. All right.